Hello, everyone. My name is Eric, and I'm your host for this week's podcast episode number 116. The show is a flagship of the paperbackwwarrior.com blog and YouTube channel where you can find over 1,500 written reviews on vintage fiction and authors and access the prior 115 episodes of this very show. Follow us on social media for daily posts on all things fiction, including new releases, pulps, paperback covers, and comics. Today's episode looks at author Harry Hart Frank Jr., which some of you may know under his pseudonym of Pat Frank. He's considered one of the modern pioneers of post-apocalyptic doomsday fiction. He lived an extraordinary life, and I'm excited to talk about him today. In addition, I'm also doing another miniature feature on book publishers. This time around, it's on those special Armed Services Edition books that were published in the 1940s. It's a neat history, and I think you'll enjoy it. Today I'm also reviewing a contemporary action horror novel titled Worm on a Hook. It was originally published in 2020, and I was just recently gifted the book from a Paperback Warrior fan, so I'm anxious to review that one for you as well. But first, let me tell you about some other new books that I've acquired by various means of late. At least they're new to me. The first is a book titled Devil House. This is a 2022 hardcover written by John Darnell that was first brought to my attention by a Paperback Warrior reader and fan named Brian Brassfield. He was kind enough to reach out to me on Facebook Messenger and mention this book to me. He said he'd like to send it to me to say thanks for doing the podcast and the blog. Hey, listen, I'm always up for free books, so I gladly accepted it. The book concerns a true crime writer who takes a job moving into a house that was the home of two murders linked to the 1980s Satanic Panic. He gets into a pretty deep mystery, finds links to his own writing. The book looks awesome, and I'm excited to read and review it. I also received digital copies of books from an author named Ian Russell. He's a fan of the blog and podcast, and he sent me an email to explain he writes a lot of the same type of fiction we cover right here on Paperback Warrior. He has a long-running series titled The Revengist, and he sent me the first book in that series. He also sent me a team-based combat book titled Go Team, which is the series' first installment. He also sent me two horror novels. One is Rock and Roll Nightmare, and the other is Under Blood Lake. So I'm looking forward to reading those. I've really gotten into this nostalgic, retro-style modern books that authors like Brian Barry do so well. So I'm kind of curious to read these as well. I received a physical copy of a book called How to Write Pulp Fiction by James Scott Bell. This was gifted to me by author Jarrett Keene. This is from Compendium Press, published in 2017. The blurb on the back is, type hard, type fast, make dough. This book digs into the successful secrets of how pulp writers developed pulp prose, the fiction formula, the best-selling pulp genres, marketing pulp fiction, and harnessing the power of a series character. This is really interesting, and I'm going to use it as a reference book when reviewing pulp literature and vintage fiction just in general. Starkhouse Press sent me a couple books by mail. The first is a twofer by author Robert Martin. The books in this particular volume are Tears for the Bride, which was originally published in 1954, and The Widow and the Web from 1955. Both of these books star Martin's detective character Jim Bennett, and this book is going to be available next month. The other book that Starkhouse Press mailed me was another twofer, this one by Elizabeth Fenwick. The two books are Goodbye, Aunt Elva, originally published in 1969, and The Last of Lysandra from 1972. This book will also be out next month. I've always enjoyed Fenwick's suspenseful mystery writing, so I'm happy to receive this book and the two detective novels by Robert Martin. And on to my next bit of business here. I wanted to remind you of what's happening this month so far. Now, on March 3rd, the podcast episode number 115 hit, and that was a feature on Louis Tremble. On March 6th, my ranking of last month's reads went up on both the podcast channel and YouTube. Last week, March 10th, I posted my shopping trip video on YouTube. This was my quick in and out visits to a couple bookstores in Nashville, Tennessee. Next week, on March 24th, I've got my new video reviewing The Butcher number 26, Terror Truckers. I'll post that as an audio-only segment for the podcast channel, and then also a screen-by-screen share on YouTube. I'm going to be doing this with Bad Taste Books, and I believe also the Book Graveyard is going to join in as well. They all cover the same type of books and fiction that Paperback Warrior covers, so it should be a lot of fun. Then I'll be back here again for another podcast episode on March 31st. March is one of those weird months where I end up doing 3 podcast episodes, so that's really cool. A lot of work for me, but, that's okay. Speaking of a lot of work, you can donate to the show on the mobile app. Just scroll to the bottom, hit desktop version, then look on the right side near the top for the donation link. Also, if you click on any reviews on the blog, near the bottom of those reviews are links to my Amazon affiliate page. If you bookmark that and order anything from Amazon using that page, then I'll get a few cents. So buy some cat food, and that'll make Amazon pitch me a dime. On to something else I just learned the other day. I thought I would share it with you here. I was talking to an Iron Age writer named Thomas Hyland. He's friends with a film producer named Dallas Sonyer. Sonyer's production company is called Bonfire Legend, and they're producing an adaptation of a Harry Whittington novel. Imagine that. The book is called Desert Stakeout, and it was a Western that Whittington wrote and had published in 1961 by Fawcett Gold Medal. It was reprinted in May of 1989 by Avon. I read and reviewed that book back on the blog in 2018. It was such a great Western paperback. I'm excited to see how the movie turns out. The movie's going to be titled Frontier Crucible, and it'll star Thomas Jane and William H. Macy. On Deadline.com, it was reported that the movie is supposed to be like a cross between Bone Tomahawk, which I really like, and Reservoir Dogs, which I also like. So that sounds really promising. Another book I reviewed on the blog is coming to the big screen. I read and reviewed Stephen King's The Institute back in 2021, and I read recently that it's going to be adapted into a television show. I was thinking it was a movie, but yeah, television show that's going to stream on the MGM Plus network this year. I enjoyed that book, but I can't say that King's books are making me anxious to see any film adaptations. I mean, really, enough's enough at this point, right? I'll say that I enjoyed the recent adaptation of Salem's Lot, but man, only half the movie was released. The rest of it was cut out by Max, so who knows when the full version of that movie is ever going to see the light of day. It just seems like everything he writes is just being optioned to movies, and they just put out everything. It's kind of ridiculous. All right, so anyway, enough of that stuff. That's all the new stuff that I know about, books that are coming out next month, and so forth. So how about we jump into the first feature today? I'm going to hit that tune that you know so well. Let's go, kids. As I mentioned in my opener, I'm presenting you a feature on Harry Hart Frank Jr. He was better known by his pseudonym Pat Frank, the name he used to write his most famous work, an early post-apocalyptic novel titled Alas, Babylon. He was considered the first of the early writers that wrote post-apocalyptic novels after the Hiroshima atomic bombing in World War II, and his life and career I found very interesting. The other reason I was drawn to this author is he died right here in Jacksonville, Florida, and his grave is located just up the road from me. But before we get to all that, let's go to the beginning. Frank was born in Chicago in 1907. His father died from the flu when Frank was really young. While attending a private prep school in New Jersey, Frank and his mother were uprooted and had to move to northeastern Florida. Frank attended the University of Florida and then took a job as a journalist for the Jacksonville Journal. Because the Atlantic Beach area of Jacksonville had very little going on in the 1920s, Frank actually made up an entire wealthy family. He then would write articles about this fictitious family and all their various day-to-day activities. In the late 1920s, Frank moved to New York, and he worked for the New York World and the New York Evening Journal, and then later he worked for the Washington Herald. I believe sometime in the 1930s he became married. When World War II began breaking out in 1939, Frank took roles as a correspondent with the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, the Overseas News Agency, and the Office of War Information. He worked in places like Australia, Turkey, Hungary, and Germany. It was during this time that Frank first saw his writing published. Beginning in June 1939, Frank was published in magazines like Adventure, Collier's, This Week, Woman's Home Companion, Argosy, and the American Magazine. After World War II, Frank was able to hit the big time with his successful debut as a novelist. His book, Mr. Atom, published in 1946, sold more than 2 million copies and was published in over a dozen countries. The book concerns an accidental nuclear explosion that destroys most of Mississippi. Only one man on Earth has survived the sterilization created by the bomb's radiation. That's Mr. Atom. It was a comical book that dealt with the sensitivity everyone was feeling after the use of atomic bombs on Japan during the war. Frank followed the book's success in 1948 with a more serious novel titled An Affair of State. This was a spy novel set just 4 months before the Cold War really began. The protagonist is an ex-serviceman bureaucrat assigned to set up a stay-behind network in Budapest to combat Soviet-occupied Hungary. The book is considered the first work of fiction to mention the actual name CIA. Remember, before this, it was simply called the OSS. 3 years later, Frank's 1951 novel, Hold Back the Night, is published. This was a very interesting publication for not only Frank, but also the American government. The book stars a frontline Marine unit fighting in the Korean War. Now, because of Frank's experiences during World War II, he injected a lot of realism into the novel's action sequences. Because of this, the U.S. government came calling on Frank to join the Korean War. They had him assist them with a propaganda documentary and to help set up a Korean film unit. In 1956, Frank's Cold War thriller, Forbidden Area, was published. This was a really neat book because it's inspired by a real event that occurred in Jacksonville, Florida in 1942. The event was known as Operation Pastorius. During World War II, Germany sent 8 secret Nazi agents to live and work in the U.S. These agents were trained in explosives in Berlin and were instructed to attack plants at Niagara Falls, Illinois, Tennessee, New York, Kentucky, and so forth. The agents were divided into 2 groups. 4 were launched from submarines using rafts and landed on Long Island in New York. The other 4 landed on Ponte Vedra Beach in Jacksonville, Florida. Both groups were caught by U.S. intelligence before anything could happen, but Frank used this premise for his book Forbidden Area, but only changed it to fit a Cold War scenario by having Soviet sleeper agents enter America. The book was published in magazine format as 7 Days to Never. It was also adapted into a television episode of Rod Serling's Playhouse and 90 show, starring Charlton Heston in 1957. On a completely different note, that Operation Pastorius event during World War II was also used as the premise in Frank Kane's short story, 30 Pieces of Lead. It appeared in Crack Detective Stories in September 1945, and I've got a review of that story on the Paperback Warrior blog. All right, so let's stop for a moment. Frank has served in World War II. He's also served in the Korean War. He wrote short stories for magazines in the late 1930s throughout the 1940s. He wrote 2 novels in the 1940s, and so far in our feature, he's had 2 novels out in the 1950s. By the 1950s, Frank has also elevated his short stories to appear in more mainstream magazines. Magazines like Cosmopolitan, the Saturday Evening Post, Nation's Business, Red Book. His book, Hold Back the Night, was also adapted into film in 1956, so he's doing really well at this point. But in 1959, his most popular novel would appear. Alas, Babylon was the title. It was originally published in hardcover by J.B. Lippincott, and then later in multiple editions, including a 1979 Bantam paperback with a great cover by Robert Hunt. That's the edition that I see the most. The book takes place in the fictional town of Fort Repose, Florida, which is 35 miles northwest of Orlando. Fort Repose is actually based on the real city of Mount Dora, a small little community that my wife and I frequent often. It's a Norman Rockwell-looking town with little shops, coffee spots, craft festivals, and a really nice concert hall. It's a place where you'll find your grandmother playing bingo on Saturday nights. The book stars a guy named Randy, and he lives in Fort Repose, and his brother is a colonel in the U.S. Air Force. The two have got this little code word that they established just in case something crazy were to ever happen. Now remember, this is 1959, and Americans were expecting the Soviets' nuclear bomb to obliterate them from existence. So the idea was that Randy's brother would send a telegram that said, "Alas, Babylon," in case of like an all-out doomsday scenario. And sure enough, Randy gets that telegram as the U.S. and Soviets begin exchanging ballistic missiles. The book is about the tourists trapped in their hotels in this little town, both brothers dealing with the post-apocalyptic chaos, prisoners escaping jail, and contamination zones. Sounds like a really cool book. According to Wikipedia, S.T. Joshi cites in his book The Modern Weird Tale that Alas, Babylon sits favorably with Stephen King's The Stand in terms of the same basic survival themes. David Brin notes that the book was instrumental in shaping his views on nuclear war and influenced his own book, The Postman, in 1982. A copy of Alas, Babylon was provided to John Lennon by journalist Larry Kane in 1965. Lennon apparently spent all night reading this book. The book was adapted into a television episode of Playhouse 90 in 1960, starring Don Murray and Burt Reynolds. Alas, Babylon is featured in David Pringle's book Science Fiction, The 100 Best Novels. Now, because of both his success with Alas, Babylon and Mr. Atom, many people began calling Frank the atomic potboiler writer. This elevated his popularity. He began writing speeches for the Democratic National Committee during the 1960 Kennedy campaign. In 1961, he was a part-time consultant to the National Aeronautics and Space Council. Frank used his experiences in this role to write another successful book titled How to Survive the H-Bomb and Why. Frank lived a fast life that was fueled by alcohol. He unfortunately died at the young age of 57 in October 1964 from acute pancreatitis. He left behind 2 children, Perry and Patrick Frank. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Frank's atomic bomb-themed Mr. Atom was published in 1946. Up until this point, the only post-apocalyptic books were sci-fi efforts based on fictional bombings or global catastrophes that hadn't occurred before. All of that changed on August 6, 1945, when Hiroshima, Japan, was bombed by Allied forces using an atomic bomb. Within a year of the atomic bombing, Mr. Atom was published, making it one of the first post-Hiroshima post-apocalyptic books, or what some refer to as Doomsday books. From there, other authors got into the subgenre of post-apocalyptic books that had more modern overtones. Those books included Tomorrow, a 1954 novel by Philip Wiley, On the Beach, a 1957 novel by Neville Shute, and the 1958 novel by Peter George titled Red Alert. So as you can see, Alas, Babylon sits in rare company as the first wave of the post-World War II Doomsday novels. Now, Pat Frank wrote an autobiography titled The Long Way Around, which chronicled his life abroad and the many travels he made working for the U.S. government. I hope you enjoyed this feature on Harry Hart Frank Jr. My sources for this feature was Pat Frank's Alas, Babylon 50 Years Later by Matt Swigger from the Florida Times-Union, imdb.com, archive.org, the article Pat Frank Dies at 57 from the October 13th, 1964 edition of the Washington Evening Star. All right, so before I serve up my second feature, my little miniature feature on Armed Forces editions, how about I break this up and just give you my book review for this episode? There's no one else in the room but me and the dog, so I'm going to guess that you're responding yes to that question. So here's a little review for you with a little preface introduction about this book. In early February, a Paperback Warrior fan and reader sent me a direct message on Facebook. His name is Dan. He said he's a big fan of a blog titled Outlaw Vern's Movie Reviews. Now, Vern, who's never revealed a last name, also writes books. Dan read Vern's book, Worm on a Hook, and advised me that I'd really like it, and he felt like I would enjoy it, and he wanted to give me a physical copy of it. And I was excited to read it. I had looked it up, and it seemed interesting, so I agreed to accept his gift, and thankfully, he sent it to me, and I'm reviewing it for you now. This is a 366-page trade paperback, and it's presented in a non-linear timeline, so the events jumping back and forth in time spreads out into the narrative. As the book begins, these construction workers are on this rural island off the coast of Washington State, and they just serve this underground tunnel system that's being used by a legendary hook-handed slasher named Stoneback. Now, Stoneback was supposed to be dead and lying in this tunnel system somewhere, but like a good Friday the 13th movie, his body's been disturbed, and now he's up and at it again, killing off all this pesky human prey. Now, Stoneback quickly slays all the construction workers, and he begins walking towards the island's annual beer festival. There's a handful of 20-something couples that are on vacation on the island, and they're there to relax, enjoy music, attend this beer festival. But there's this mysterious person that's renting the upstairs portion of the couple's Airbnb. She seems like she has some kind of past connection to this facility, this house. And when a guy comes to visit, he tells the couples that this Airbnb site is the original place where Stoneback killed a bunch of people years ago. So this girl that's living upstairs on this vacation, her name's Florence, could she be the only survivor of Stoneback's killing spree years ago? Worm on a Hook is an obvious homage to the blood-soaked slasher cinema that haunted Kodak 5247 film stock in the 1970s and 80s, but I actually found the book to be more like a Marvel mashup of like Black Widow fighting Deadpool. There's more action than horror with the book's unique approach to character development, presented as these various life events for both the main character and this ultimate final girl named Florence, and of course the legendary killer himself, Stoneback. The book delves into Florence's past, what her history is with Stoneback, and the federal government as well. Their personal histories and these various collisions made for an entertaining reading experience that propelled the central narrative at this really, really fast pace. Overall, I really enjoyed Worm on a Hook, and you will too if you like nonstop action. I mean, the book has lots of machine gun firefights, explosions. It's got like martial arts fighting, like UFC stuff in cages. I mean, it's a wild, outrageous mix of styles. Again, the book is called Worm on a Hook. The author's name is simply Vern. There's no last name, just Vern, Vern. You can get it on Amazon for $14 in paperback. I think there's also an ebook as well. So that's my take on Worm on a Hook. And Dan, thanks for sending me this book. I really appreciate it. I'm going to pass it on to a friend of mine. All right, so how about another smaller feature just to wrap us up here? Are you ready for another paperback history lesson? I really like doing these. Let's jump into a series of paperback publications that came out in the 1940s. All right, so in 1942, an American nonprofit organization was founded by booksellers, publishers, librarians, and authors. It was called the Council on Books in Wartime. It promoted the use of books to influence the thinking of American citizens regarding World War II. In 1943, the publisher, W. W. Norton, made a proposal to the council. He wrote to them saying, quote, "It has long been felt that a major contribution of the industry could properly lie along a new and completely different line, that of making freely available to our armed forces the entertainment, the information, the morale, and even the inspiration which is in books." End quote. Norton's company accepted the proposal to provide the U.S. Armed Forces books. A team of 8 staff members were tasked with creating this Armed Forces Editions line of books. Publishers were asked to submit a list of titles that they feel would be acceptable. A special committee of 6 to 10 people used these lists to prepare a list of book recommendations. The final approved list was made by Lieutenant Colonel Ray Troutman of the Special Services Division of the Army and Isabel DuBois, librarian of the United States Navy. Armed Services Editions contracted with authors in a simple arrangement, and these books were to be kept out of the private sector. The idea wasn't to compete with regular editions of books. This was a completely separate deal. The books were to be free to military service members, both male and female, but a 1-cent royalty was paid to the publisher. Later, the royalty part was even waived altogether or partially waived as more and more authors and publishers generously agreed to lower costs to generate more books for servicemen. The U.S. government's War Production Board allocated metal for printing plates, and special exemptions were allowed for the acquisition of paper. The first Armed Services editions appeared in September of 1943. It was 30 titles a month, and that increased to 40 titles just 1 month later. These books featured 2 columns of text per page for economic reasons. The cover dimensions were 5.5 inches by 3 7/8 inches, or 6.5 inches by 4.5 inches, depending on the book length. There was very little time and resources committed to creating colorful covers for these paperbacks. A lot of times it was kind of like they took the covers and made them like really tiny squares on the covers of these paperbacks, so it wasn't anything fancy. The books were shipped all over the globe to soldiers stationed on military bases, war zones, military hospitals, everywhere. When the publishing came to an end in 1947, 126 million books have been published and distributed. Some of the books included were authored by the likes of John Steinbeck, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Max Brand, Philip Wiley, Ernest Hemingway, C.S. Forester, Rex Stout, H.G. Wells, Ernest Haycox, Luke Short, Jack London, Dorothy L. Sayers, and Craig Rice, just to name a few. My source for this feature was Kevin Hanser's Paperback Price Guide, 3rd edition. And I hope you enjoyed this episode as I wrap us up here. Remember to follow Paperback Warrior on Facebook, X, Threads, Instagram, YouTube, and of course at paperbackwwarrior.com. Be sure to subscribe, like, repost, donate, and generally just talk a good game about Paperback Warrior. Next week, I'm going to have that Butcher review up on here and on YouTube, so be sure to check that out. I'm going to return on March 31st with another exciting episode. Thanks for watching this on YouTube and also for listening to this on whatever streaming platform you've chosen. And remember, enjoy whatever it is you're doing.